The Mércia Nakashima case, when love becomes obsession and a police officer becomes a killer. In the affluent suburbs of São Paulo, Brazil, there lived a brilliant young lawyer whose life would be cut short by the very person who claimed to love her most. Mércia Nakashima was a 28-year-old attorney with a promising career, a loving family, and dreams of building a successful legal practice. She was intelligent, independent, and determined to make her mark in the competitive world of Brazilian law. But Mércia's life would become entangled with that of Mizael Bispo de Souza, a 29-year-old military police officer whose obsessive love would transform into deadly rage when she decided to end their relationship. What began as a romance between two successful professionals would evolve into one of Brazil's most notorious cases of femicide, exposing the dangerous intersection of domestic violence, police corruption, and the abuse of power. On May 20, 2010, Mércia Nakashima disappeared after leaving her law office in São Paulo. For days, her family and friends searched desperately for any sign of what had happened to her. When her body was finally discovered, submerged in a car at the bottom of a reservoir in Nazaré Paulista, the investigation would reveal a carefully planned murder that had been orchestrated by the man who had once promised to protect and cherish her. The case would shock Brazil, not only because of its brutality, but because the perpetrator was a police officer who had used his training, resources, and connections to plan and execute the perfect crime. Mizael's position of authority and his knowledge of investigative procedures had given him advantages that most criminals do not possess, making the case even more challenging for investigators to solve. The murder of Mércia Nakashima would become a symbol of the epidemic of violence against women in Brazil, and would expose serious problems within the military police force. Her case would inspire documentaries, television specials, and countless discussions about domestic violence, police accountability, and the protection of women who try to escape abusive relationships. This is the story of a brilliant woman whose only crime was falling in love with the wrong man, and whose death would reveal the terrifying extent to which some people will go when their obsessions are threatened. It's a story about power, control, and the deadly consequences of refusing to accept rejection. Mércia Nakashima's case would ultimately lead to important changes in how Brazilian authorities handled domestic violence cases involving police officers, but those changes came too late to save her life. Her story serves as a reminder that badges and uniforms do not make someone immune to committing the most heinous crimes, and that the very people sworn to protect society can sometimes become its greatest threats. If you think you understand the depths of obsessive love and the lengths some people will go to maintain control over their partners, you're about to discover a case that will challenge everything you thought you knew about trust, betrayal, and the abuse of power. The brilliant lawyer Mércia Nakashima was born on March 15, 1982, to a middle-class Japanese-Brazilian family in São Paulo. Her parents, Hideko and Carlos Nakashima, had immigrated to Brazil in the 1970s, seeking better opportunities for their future children. They instilled in Mércia the values of hard work, education, and perseverance that would define her character throughout her life. From an early age, Mércia displayed exceptional intelligence and a natural aptitude for academics. She excelled in school, consistently ranking among the top students in her class and showing particular talent in languages, literature, and social sciences. Her teachers recognized her potential and encouraged her to pursue higher education, seeing in her the makings of a future leader. Mércia's decision to study law was influenced by her desire to help others and her fascination with the Brazilian legal system. She enrolled at Universidade Presbiteriana Mackenzie, one of São Paulo's most prestigious law schools, where she quickly established herself as a dedicated and talented student. Her professors remembered her as someone who asked thoughtful questions, participated actively in class discussions, and showed genuine passion for justice and legal advocacy. During her university years, Mércia worked part-time at various law firms, gaining practical experience while completing her studies. She was particularly interested in civil law and family law, areas where she felt she could make a real difference in people's lives. Her supervisors consistently praised her work ethic, attention to detail, and natural ability to connect with clients. After graduating with honors in 2005, Mércia began working as an associate at a respected law firm in São Paulo's financial district. She specialized in contract law and corporate litigation, handling cases for both individual clients and major corporations. Her colleagues described her as brilliant, hard-working, and completely dedicated to her profession. By Arlene Bar, Mércia had established herself as a rising star in the snow polo legal community. She was earning a substantial income, had built a network of professional contacts, and was considering starting her own practice. Her personal life was equally fulfilling. She maintained close relationships with her family, had a circle of loyal friends, and enjoyed traveling, reading, and attending cultural events. Mércia was also known for her independence and strong personality. She was not someone who compromised her values or allowed others to control her decisions. Friends described her as confident, assertive, and unwilling to tolerate disrespect or manipulation. These qualities, which served her well in her professional life, would later become sources of conflict in her relationship with Mizael. In her personal relationships, Mércia was selective and cautious. She had dated several men over the years, but had never found someone who shared her ambitions and respected her independence. She was looking for a partner who would support her career goals and treat her as an equal, someone who understood that her professional success was as important to her as any romantic relationship. When Mércia met Mizael Bispo de Souza in early 2009, she was initially attracted to his confidence, his stable career as a military police officer, and his apparent respect for her accomplishments. He seemed different from other men she had dated, more mature, more serious about commitment, and more supportive of her professional ambitions. What Mércia didn't realize was that beneath Mizael's charming exterior lay a deeply troubled man with serious issues related to control, jealousy, and possessiveness. The qualities that had made her successful in her career, her independence, her strong will, and her refusal to be controlled, would eventually trigger the violent obsession that would cost her life. The military police officer, Mizael Bispo de Souza, was born on August 3, 1980, in a working-class neighborhood of São Paulo. Unlike Mércia's stable middle-class upbringing, Mizael's childhood was marked by financial struggles, family dysfunction, and early exposure to violence. His father was frequently absent, and his mother worked multiple jobs to support the family, leaving Mizael and his siblings largely unsupervised. From a young age, Mizael displayed behavioral problems that would persist throughout his life. He was aggressive with other children, had difficulty accepting authority, and showed signs of the controlling personality that would later define his relationships with women. Teachers and neighbors noticed his tendency to bully smaller children and his inability to handle frustration or rejection. Despite these early warning signs, Mizael was intelligent and physically capable, qualities that would serve him well when he decided to pursue a career in law enforcement. In 2001, at the age of 21, he joined the São Paulo Military Police, attracted by the steady income, job security, and authority that came with wearing a uniform. Mizael's training as a military police officer provided him with skills that would later prove dangerous in his personal life. He learned firearms handling, surveillance techniques, interrogation methods, and investigative procedures. He also developed connections within the law enforcement community that would later help him in his attempts to cover up his crimes. During his early years as a police officer, Mizael's performance was generally satisfactory, though some supervisors noted his tendency to be overly aggressive with suspects and his difficulty working as part of a team. He preferred assignments that gave him individual authority and seemed to enjoy the power that came with his position. Mizael's personal relationships followed a disturbing pattern that would become more pronounced over time. He was attracted to successful, independent women, but once in relationships, he became increasingly controlling and possessive. He would monitor his girlfriends' activities, question their friendships, and become jealous of their professional achievements. Several of Mizael's former girlfriends would later describe similar experiences. Relationships that began with intense romance and apparent devotion, but gradually became suffocating and frightening. He would use his position as a police officer to intimidate them, often implying that he had access to information and resources that could make their lives difficult if they crossed him. One former girlfriend, who spoke anonymously to investigators, described Mizael as charming at first, but then he became like a prison guard. He wanted to know where I was every minute, who I was talking to, what I was thinking. When I tried to break up with him, he threatened to ruin my reputation and my career. By the time Mizael met Mércia in 2009, he had developed sophisticated methods of control and manipulation. He had learned to present himself as the ideal boyfriend, protective, devoted, and supportive, while gradually isolating his partners from their friends and family. He was particularly skilled at identifying successful women who might be vulnerable to his attention and apparent stability. Mizael's attraction to Mércia was immediate and intense. Here was a woman who represented everything he wanted but felt he couldn't have: education, success, social status, and financial independence. In his mind, winning Mércia's love would validate his worth and elevate his own status in society. But Mizael's love for Mércia was not healthy or genuine. It was possessive, obsessive, and ultimately destructive. He saw her not as an independent person with her own goals and desires, but as a prize to be won and controlled. When she eventually tried to assert her independence and end their relationship, his love would transform into the deadly rage that would cost her life. The relationship. Mércia and Mizael met in February 2009 at a social event attended by professionals from various fields, including law enforcement and the legal community. Mizael was immediately drawn to Mércia's intelligence, beauty, and professional success. While she was initially impressed by his apparent maturity, his stable career, and his knowledge of law enforcement procedures that sometimes intersected with her legal work, their early courtship followed a pattern that would later be recognized as typical of abusive relationships. Mizael was charming, attentive, and seemingly devoted to Mércia's happiness. He would surprise her with expensive gifts, take her to upscale restaurants, and constantly tell her how special and beautiful she was. He appeared to be genuinely interested in her career and would ask detailed questions about her cases and professional goals. Mércia's friends and family initially approved of the relationship. Mizael presented himself as a responsible, stable man who clearly adored Mércia and seemed committed to building a future with her. He was polite to her parents, respectful to her friends, and appeared to support her professional ambitions. To outside observers, they seemed like a successful, well-matched couple. However, subtle signs of Mizael's controlling nature began to emerge within the first few months of their relationship. He would call Mércia multiple times throughout the day, ostensibly to check on her well-being, but actually to monitor her activities. He would ask detailed questions about her interactions with male colleagues and clients, expressing concern about her safety in ways that seemed caring, but were actually possessive. Mizael also began to insert himself into Mércia's professional life in ways that made her uncomfortable. He would offer to provide security for her when she had to work late or meet with difficult clients. He would suggest that certain male colleagues or clients might have inappropriate intentions toward her, planting seeds of doubt and paranoia that served to isolate her from her professional network. As the relationship progressed, Mizael's behavior became more overtly controlling. He would show up at Mércia's office unannounced, claiming he was in the neighborhood but actually checking to see if she was where she said she would be. He would go through her phone when she wasn't looking, questioning her about text messages and phone calls from friends and colleagues. Mércia began to feel suffocated by Mizael's constant attention and surveillance. She tried to address the issue with him directly, explaining that she needed space and independence to maintain her professional effectiveness. Mizael would apologize and promise to change, but his behavior would inevitably return to the same controlling patterns. The relationship reached a crisis point in late 2009 when Mércia discovered that Mizael had been conducting background checks on her friends and colleagues using police resources. When she confronted him about this violation of her privacy and his abuse of his official position, he became angry and defensive, accusing her of being ungrateful for his protection and suggesting that she was hiding something from him. This incident marked the beginning of the end of their relationship. Mércia realized that Mizael's behavior was not normal or healthy, and she began to distance herself from him emotionally and physically. She started making excuses to avoid spending time with him and began confiding in her friends about her concerns regarding his possessive behavior. Mizael sensed that he was losing control over Mércia and responded by escalating his surveillance and manipulation tactics. He would follow her to work, monitor her social media accounts, and even contact her clients and colleagues under the pretense of police business to gather information about her activities. By early Yiling, Mércia had decided that the relationship was over. She had come to understand that Mizael's love was not genuine affection, but obsessive possession, and she recognized that his behavior was becoming increasingly dangerous. She began planning how to end the relationship safely, aware that his position as a police officer and his access to weapons made him potentially very dangerous. What Mércia didn't realize was that Mizael had already begun planning what he would do if she tried to leave him. In his mind, if he couldn't have her, no one could. The stage was set for a tragedy that would shock Brazil and expose the deadly consequences of obsessive love, combined with the power and resources of law enforcement. The breakup. In March 2010, Mércia made the decision that would ultimately cost her life. She decided to end her relationship with Mizael permanently. The decision came after months of increasingly controlling behavior and several incidents that had made her fear for her safety and professional reputation. She had consulted with friends, family members, and even a therapist about the best way to handle the situation. Mércia's decision to break up with Mizael was not made lightly. She understood that his position as a police officer and his access to weapons made him potentially dangerous. But she also knew that she could not continue living under his constant surveillance and control. Her career was suffering, her friendships were strained, and her mental health was deteriorating under the pressure of his obsessive attention. The breakup conversation took place at Mércia's apartment on a Sunday afternoon in mid-March. She had chosen a time when she knew Mizael would be off duty, but when neighbors would be home, providing some measure of security. She had also informed a trusted friend about the timing of the conversation, and had arranged for the friend to call her afterward to check on her safety. Mércia approached the conversation carefully, trying to be firm but not confrontational. She explained to Mizael that their relationship was not working, and that she needed to focus on her career and personal growth. She emphasized that her decision was final, and that she hoped they could part amicably without any drama or conflict. Mizael's reaction was immediate and intense. He refused to accept Mércia's decision, insisting that their relationship was perfect and that she was making a terrible mistake. He alternated between pleading with her to reconsider and becoming angry about what he perceived as her ingratitude for everything he had done for her. When Mércia remained firm in her decision, Mizael's behavior became more threatening. He reminded her of his position as a police officer and implied that he had access to information and resources that could make her life difficult. He suggested that her law practice could face scrutiny from authorities and that her professional reputation could be damaged if she crossed him. Despite these threats, Mércia stood her ground. She told Mizael that their relationship was over and asked him to leave her apartment and not contact her again. She made it clear that any further harassment would be reported to his superiors and that she was prepared to take legal action if necessary to protect herself. Mizael eventually left the apartment, but not before making it clear that he did not accept the breakup and would not give up on their relationship. His parting words were ominous. "You belong to me. No one else will ever have you if I can't." In the days following the breakup, Mizael's harassment of Mércia escalated dramatically. He would call her constantly, send text messages at all hours, and show up at her office and apartment building. He would follow her to court appearances and client meetings, making his presence known in ways that were clearly intended to intimidate her. Mércia documented these incidents and considered filing a restraining order, but she was concerned about the potential professional consequences of taking legal action against a police officer. She also worried that formal legal proceedings might escalate Mizael's behavior and make him even more dangerous. Instead, Mércia tried to handle the situation through informal channels. She contacted Mizael's supervisor at the military police and explained the situation, hoping that official intervention might convince him to stop his harassment. She also changed her phone number, varied her daily routines, and began staying with friends on some nights to avoid being alone in her apartment. But these measures were not enough to deter Mizael's obsessive pursuit. His training as a police officer had taught him surveillance techniques that made it easy for him to track Mércia's movements, despite her attempts to avoid him. His access to official databases allowed him to monitor her activities in ways that would have been impossible for a civilian stalker. As April turned to May 2010, Mércia's friends and family noticed that she seemed increasingly stressed and fearful. She had lost weight, was having trouble sleeping, and seemed constantly worried about Mizael's next move. She confided to her closest friends that she was afraid of what he might do if she continued to reject him. What Mércia didn't know was that Mizael had already decided that if he couldn't have her, no one could. He had begun planning her murder, using his knowledge of police procedures and investigative techniques to design what he believed would be the perfect crime. The woman he claimed to love had become the target of his deadly obsession. The plan. Throughout April and early May 2010, While Mércia tried to rebuild her life and career after ending her relationship with Mizael, he was methodically planning her murder. His training as a military police officer had given him knowledge of investigative procedures, forensic techniques, and criminal behavior that he now turned toward creating what he believed would be the perfect crime. Mizael's plan was sophisticated and carefully thought out, reflecting both his intelligence and his intimate knowledge of how murder investigations are conducted. He understood that most killers are caught because they act impulsively, leave evidence behind, or fail to establish credible alibis. He was determined to avoid these common mistakes. The first element of Mizael's plan involved establishing a pattern of normal behavior that would provide him with an alibi for the time of the murder. He began working extra shifts and volunteering for special assignments that would create official records of his whereabouts. He also started socializing more with colleagues, ensuring that multiple people would remember seeing him on the day he planned to kill Mércia.
Mizael also began studying Mércia's daily routines with the systematic approach of a professional surveillance operation. He used his police training to observe her movements without being detected, noting the time she left her apartment, the routes she took to work, and the locations where she met with clients. He identified the times and places where she would be most vulnerable to attack. The location Mizael chose for disposing of Mércia's body demonstrated his understanding of forensic investigation. He selected a remote reservoir in Nazaré Paulista, about 60 kilometers from São Paulo, where the deep water would make it difficult to recover evidence and where the isolation would minimize the chances of witnesses. He had visited the location multiple times to study the terrain and identify the best approach routes. Mizael's plan also included measures to deflect suspicion away from himself. He knew that ex-boyfriends are always primary suspects in cases involving murdered women, so he prepared to present himself as a heartbroken but innocent former lover who was cooperating fully with the investigation. He even practiced the emotional responses he would display when questioned by investigators. The weapon Mizael planned to use was his service pistol, which he could access without raising suspicion and which would be difficult to trace back to him if the body was never recovered. He also planned to use his police vehicle for transportation, knowing that official vehicles are less likely to be stopped or questioned by other officers. One of the most chilling aspects of Mizael's plan was his decision to make Mércia's death appear to be a suicide. He intended to stage the scene to suggest that she had driven to the reservoir and killed herself, perhaps out of depression over their failed relationship. This would explain her presence at the remote location and provide a motive that didn't implicate him directly. Mizael also prepared for the possibility that his plan might fail or that he might be caught. He began gathering information about Mércia's personal life that he could use to damage her reputation if necessary. He planned to suggest that she had been involved in illegal activities or had enemies who might want to harm her, creating alternative theories for investigators to pursue. The psychological preparation for the murder was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Mizael's planning. He spent weeks convincing himself that killing Mércia was justified, that she had betrayed and humiliated him, and that he had no choice but to eliminate her. He transformed his love for her into hatred, his desire to protect her into a need to destroy her. By mid-May 2010, Mizael's plan was complete. He had identified the perfect opportunity, prepared his alibi, and steeled himself for the act of murder. All he needed was the right moment to put his plan into action, a moment when Mércia would be vulnerable and when he could act without being observed. That moment would come on May 20, 2010. When Mércia's daily routine would take her to a location where Mizael could approach her without witnesses. The brilliant lawyer who had dedicated her life to justice would become the victim of a crime planned and executed by someone who had sworn to protect and serve the public. The murder. On the morning of May 20, 2010, Mércia Nakashima began what would be the last day of her life with her usual routine. She woke up early in her São Paulo apartment, reviewed her schedule for the day, and prepared for several important client meetings that were scheduled throughout the afternoon and evening. She had no way of knowing that Mizael had been monitoring her movements and had identified this day as the perfect opportunity to execute his deadly plan. Mércia's schedule that day included a late afternoon meeting with a client in a suburban office building, followed by dinner with a potential new client who was considering hiring her firm for a complex corporate litigation case. These meetings represented important opportunities for her growing legal practice, and she was focused on making good impressions and securing new business. At approximately 6:30 p.m., Mércia left her office in downtown São Paulo and drove toward her first appointment. She was driving her own car, a silver Honda Civic that she had purchased the previous year. She had spoken with her assistant before leaving, confirming the details of her evening appointments and promising to call in the morning to discuss the outcomes of her meetings. What Mércia didn't know was that Mizael had been following her throughout the day, using his police training to conduct surveillance without being detected. He had positioned himself along her expected route and was waiting for the right moment to intercept her when she would be alone and vulnerable. The attack occurred at approximately 7:15 p.m. in a parking garage near Mércia's first appointment. Mizael had anticipated her arrival time and had positioned himself in the garage where he could approach her car without being seen by security cameras or witnesses. When Mércia parked and began walking toward the elevator, he confronted her. According to the reconstruction later developed by investigators, Mizael initially tried to convince Mércia to talk with him, claiming that he had important information to share with her and that he needed to explain his recent behavior. When she refused and tried to walk away, he became violent, forcing her back toward her car at gunpoint. Mizael then forced Mércia to drive to a secondary location where he had planned to kill her. He directed her to drive toward Nazaré Paulista, using back roads and routes that he had scouted in advance to avoid traffic cameras and police checkpoints. During this drive, which lasted approximately 90 minutes, he continued to try to convince her to resume their relationship. When Mércia continued to refuse his demands and made it clear that she would never return to him voluntarily, Mizael's rage finally overcame any remaining restraint. At a secluded location near the reservoir where he had planned to dispose of her body, he shot her multiple times with his service weapon, killing her instantly. After the murder, Mizael implemented the disposal plan he had been developing for weeks. He placed Mércia's body in the driver's seat of her car and drove the vehicle to the edge of the reservoir. He then pushed the car into the deep water, where it sank quickly and disappeared from view. The location was so remote and the water so deep that he believed the car and body would never be found. Mizael then began executing the alibi portion of his plan. He had arranged for a colleague to pick him up at a predetermined location several kilometers from the reservoir, claiming that his own vehicle had broken down while he was visiting a friend in the area. This colleague later confirmed that Mizael had seemed normal and relaxed when he picked him up, showing no signs of having just committed murder. By 11 p.m. on May 20th, Mizael was back in São Paulo, having dinner with friends at a restaurant where multiple witnesses could confirm his presence. He appeared calm and sociable, participating in conversations and showing no unusual behavior that might later be remembered as suspicious. Meanwhile, Mércia's failure to appear for her dinner appointment had been noticed by her potential client, who tried calling her cell phone several times before giving up and leaving the restaurant. When Mércia failed to return home that night and didn't answer her phone the next morning, her family and friends began to worry that something terrible had happened to her. The investigation begins. When Mércia Nakashima failed to appear for work on May 21, 2010, and couldn't be reached by phone, her assistant immediately contacted her family and closest friends. Mércia was known for her reliability and professionalism. She had never missed an appointment without notice and always kept her phone charged and accessible. Her sudden disappearance was completely out of character and immediately raised alarm bells among those who knew her. Mércia's parents, Hideko and Carlos Nakashima, contacted the São Paulo Civil Police that afternoon to report their daughter missing. They provided investigators with details about her schedule on May 20th, her recent personal and professional activities, and their concerns about her ex-boyfriend Mizael's increasingly obsessive behavior since their breakup.
Detective Captain Roberto Silva was assigned to lead the missing person investigation, an experienced investigator with over 15 years in the São Paulo Civil Police. Silva immediately recognized that this case had the potential to be more serious than a simple missing person report. The circumstances of Mércia's disappearance, a successful professional woman vanishing without a trace, suggested the possibility of foul play. The initial investigation focused on retracing Mércia's movements on May 20th. Investigators interviewed her assistant, her clients, and the restaurant staff where she was supposed to have dinner. They quickly established that she had left her office at 6:30 p.m. and had never arrived at her 7 p.m. appointment, narrowing the time frame for whatever had happened to her. Security camera footage from Mércia's office building showed her leaving at the expected time and walking to her car in the underground parking garage. However, the cameras in the garage where she had parked were not functioning properly, leaving investigators without visual evidence of what had happened after she reached her vehicle. The discovery that Mércia's car was also missing confirmed investigators' suspicions that she had not disappeared voluntarily. A successful lawyer would not abandon her car, her purse, and her professional obligations without explanation. The evidence strongly suggested that she had been abducted, possibly by someone she knew and trusted enough to approach her vehicle. Detective Silva's investigation quickly focused on Mizael Bispo de Souza, when interviews with Mércia's friends and family revealed the extent of his obsessive behavior following their breakup. Multiple witnesses described his constant phone calls, his unwelcome appearances at her workplace, and his threats about what would happen if she continued to reject him. When investigators attempted to interview Mizael on May 22nd, they found him to be cooperative but evasive. He expressed concern about Mércia's disappearance and offered to help with the investigation in any way possible. However, his account of his activities on May 20th contained inconsistencies that raised suspicions among the experienced investigators. Mizael claimed that he had been working late on May 20th and had then visited a friend in Nazaré Paulista, returning to São Paulo around 11 p.m. While he could provide witnesses to confirm his presence in São Paulo that evening, his explanation for the trip to Nazaré Paulista was vague and unconvincing. The investigation took on new urgency when Mércia's cell phone records revealed that her phone had stopped transmitting signals at approximately 7:30 p.m. on May 20th in an area between São Paulo and Nazaré Paulista. This information correlated suspiciously with Mizael's claimed trip to that region on the same evening. Detective Silva obtained a warrant to search Mizael's apartment and police vehicle, but the search yielded no immediate evidence of his involvement in Mércia's disappearance. Mizael had been careful to clean his vehicle and dispose of any physical evidence that might link him to the crime. However, investigators did discover that Mizael had been conducting unauthorized background checks on Mércia and her associates using police databases. This abuse of his official position demonstrated his obsessive monitoring of her activities and provided additional evidence of his unstable mental state. Regarding their relationship, as the investigation continued, Detective Silva became increasingly convinced that Mizael was responsible for Mércia's disappearance, but he lacked the physical evidence needed to make an arrest. The case had become a race against time. If Mércia was still alive, every hour of delay reduced the chances of finding her safely. The search, as days turned into weeks without any sign of Mércia Nakashima, the search for the missing lawyer intensified and expanded beyond the initial focus on São Paulo. Detective Silva's team had identified Mizael as their primary suspect, but without physical evidence or a body. They needed to cast a wider net to locate Mércia and build a case against her suspected killer. The search effort involved multiple agencies and hundreds of personnel. The São Paulo Civil Police coordinated with the military police, the federal police, and local authorities in surrounding municipalities to conduct systematic searches of areas where Mércia might have been taken. Special attention was paid to the region around Nazaré Paulista, where Mizael claimed to have been visiting a friend on the night of the disappearance. Volunteer search teams organized by Mércia's family and friends combed through parks, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings throughout the São Paulo metropolitan area. These volunteers, many of them fellow lawyers and legal professionals, were determined to find their colleague and bring her home safely. Their efforts generated significant media attention and kept public focus on the case. The investigation team used advanced technology to analyze cell phone tower data, attempting to trace the exact route that Mércia's phone had taken before it stopped transmitting signals. This analysis revealed that her phone had traveled along back roads toward Nazaré Paulista, following a route that was consistent with someone trying to avoid main highways and traffic cameras. Underwater search teams were deployed to search reservoirs, lakes, and rivers in the areas where Mércia's phone signals had last been detected. These searches were time-consuming and expensive, requiring specialized equipment and trained divers who could work in the murky waters of the region's numerous bodies of water. Meanwhile, the investigation into Mizael's background revealed a pattern of controlling and obsessive behavior in his previous relationships. Former girlfriends came forward to describe similar experiences of harassment and intimidation, painting a picture of a man who became dangerous when rejected. This information strengthened investigators' belief that he was responsible for Mércia's disappearance. The media coverage of the case was extensive, with television stations, newspapers, and online outlets providing regular updates on the search efforts and the investigation. Mércia's photograph was displayed widely, and the public was asked to report any information that might help locate her. The case became a symbol of the broader issue of violence against women in Brazil. Psychological profilers working with the investigation team developed a profile of the likely perpetrator that matched Mizael's characteristics almost perfectly. They predicted that whoever had taken Mércia would have disposed of her body in a location that was familiar to them, probably somewhere they had visited before and felt confident they could access without being observed. This psychological profile led investigators to focus more intensively on the Nazaré Paulista region, particularly on remote areas around the various reservoirs and lakes in the area. The profilers suggested that the perpetrator would have chosen a location where the body would be difficult to find, but where they felt confident about access and escape routes. On June 15, 2010, nearly a month after Mércia's disappearance, the breakthrough finally came. A fisherman reported seeing what appeared to be the roof of a submerged car in the Atabenha Reservoir, a large body of water in the Nazaré Paulista area. The location was remote and accessible only by a rough dirt road that few people used. Underwater recovery teams were immediately dispatched to the location. Using sonar equipment and underwater cameras, they confirmed that there was indeed a vehicle submerged in approximately 15 meters of water. The car appeared to match the description of Mércia's silver Honda Civic, and its location was consistent with the cell phone data and Mizael's claimed presence in the area. The recovery operation was complex and emotionally charged. As the car was slowly raised from the bottom of the reservoir, investigators and family members gathered at the scene, knowing that they were likely about to discover Mércia's remains and finally learn the truth about what had happened to her. The discovery on June 16, 2010, after nearly a month of intensive searching, the submerged Honda Civic was successfully raised from the depths of the Atabenha Reservoir. The recovery operation had taken most of the day, with specialized equipment and experienced divers working carefully to preserve any evidence that might be contained within the vehicle. As the car emerged from the water, investigators could see through the windows that there was indeed a body inside, positioned in the driver's seat. The sight was devastating for Mércia's family members, who had maintained hope throughout the search that she might somehow still be alive. Their worst fears were now confirmed. Mércia Nakashima was dead. The initial examination of the vehicle revealed that it had been in the water for an extended period, consistent with the timeline of Mércia's disappearance. The car's windows were closed, and there were no obvious signs of damage that might indicate an accident. The positioning of the vehicle and the body suggested that this was not a case of accidental drowning. Dr. Patricia Santos, the forensic pathologist assigned to examine Mércia's remains, conducted the autopsy at the São Paulo Institute of Legal Medicine. Despite the effects of prolonged submersion, she was able to determine that Mércia had died from multiple gunshot wounds to the torso and head. The wounds were consistent with close-range shots from a medium-caliber handgun. The autopsy findings definitively ruled out suicide or accidental death. The number and location of the gunshot wounds indicated that Mércia had been murdered by someone else, and the positioning of her body in the car suggested that she had been placed there after death. This was clearly a case of homicide, followed by an attempt to conceal the crime. Forensic examination of the vehicle yielded additional crucial evidence. Despite the prolonged submersion, investigators were able to recover fingerprints, DNA evidence, and other trace materials that would help identify the perpetrator. The car's interior showed signs of having been cleaned before it was submerged, suggesting that the killer had attempted to remove evidence. Ballistics analysis of the bullets recovered from Mércia's body revealed that they had been fired from a .40 caliber pistol, the same type of weapon carried by São Paulo military police officers. This finding provided a crucial link to Mizael, who carried exactly this type of weapon as part of his official equipment.
The location where the car was found also provided important evidence about the killer's knowledge and planning. The remote access road to the reservoir was not well known to the general public and would have required local knowledge or advanced scouting to locate. The spot where the car had been submerged was in the deepest part of the reservoir, suggesting that the killer had specifically chosen this location to make recovery difficult. Investigators also discovered that the car's GPS system had been disabled and that Mércia's cell phone was missing from the vehicle. These details suggested that the killer had taken steps to prevent electronic tracking and had removed evidence that might have provided additional information about the crime. The discovery of Mércia's body transformed the missing person investigation into a homicide case, with Detective Silva now leading a team focused on gathering evidence to arrest and prosecute her killer. While the circumstantial evidence strongly pointed to Mizael, investigators needed to build an airtight case that would stand up in court. The news of Mércia's death sent shockwaves through the São Paulo legal community and sparked renewed discussions about violence against women in Brazil. Her colleagues and friends organized memorial services and called for justice for their murdered colleague. The case became a rallying point for advocates working to combat domestic violence and femicide. For Mércia's family, the discovery brought both closure and devastating grief. While they finally knew what had happened to their daughter, they now faced the reality that she had been brutally murdered by someone she had once trusted and loved. Their focus shifted from hoping for her safe return to demanding justice for her death. Building the case. With Mércia's body recovered and the cause of death established as homicide, Detective Silva and his team faced the challenge of building a case strong enough to secure a conviction against Mizael Bispo de Souza. While the circumstantial evidence was compelling, they needed to establish a clear chain of evidence that would prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mizael was the killer. The forensic evidence from the car and Mércia's body provided several crucial leads. DNA analysis revealed the presence of genetic material that didn't belong to Mércia, and investigators worked to match this evidence to potential suspects. Hair fibers and other trace evidence found in the vehicle were also analyzed for potential matches to Mizael. Ballistics experts conducted detailed analysis of the bullets recovered from Mércia's body and compared them to test fires from Mizael's service weapon. While the prolonged submersion had affected some of the ballistic evidence, experts were able to determine that the bullets were consistent with having been fired from Mizael's gun or a weapon of the same make and model. The investigation team also focused on establishing a timeline of Mizael's movements on May 20, 2010. They interviewed his colleagues, friends, and family members to verify his claimed activities and identify any inconsistencies in his story. Cell phone records and GPS data from his police vehicle were analyzed to track his actual locations throughout the day. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when investigators discovered that Mizael had made several reconnaissance trips to the Nazaré Paulista area in the weeks before Mércia's murder. Security camera footage from gas stations and toll booths showed his vehicle traveling to the region on multiple occasions, contradicting his claim that he was unfamiliar with the area. Investigators also uncovered evidence that Mizael had been researching methods of body disposal and had accessed police databases to study unsolved murder cases. His computer search history revealed queries about underwater decomposition, forensic evidence recovery, and techniques for avoiding detection during criminal activities. The investigation revealed that Mizael had been planning the murder for weeks, if not months. He had studied Mércia's routines, identified vulnerable locations where he could approach her, and selected the disposal site well in advance. This evidence of premeditation would be crucial for securing the most serious charges against him. Witnesses came forward to describe Mizael's increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks following his breakup with Mércia. Colleagues reported that he had seemed distracted and agitated, and several people remembered him making disturbing comments about what he would do if Mércia continued to reject him. The investigation also revealed that Mizael had attempted to create false evidence to support his alibi. He had asked friends to lie about his whereabouts on May 20th and had tried to manipulate official records to support his version of events. These attempts at evidence tampering provided additional charges against him. Financial records showed that Mizael had made unusual cash withdrawals in the days before the murder, possibly to avoid creating electronic records of purchases related to his crime. He had also taken time off from work using sick leave, giving him the flexibility to plan and execute the murder without his absence being noticed. As the evidence mounted, Detective Silva felt confident that they had built a strong case against Mizael. However, he knew that prosecuting a police officer would present unique challenges, as Mizael's colleagues and superiors might be reluctant to believe that one of their own was capable of such a crime. The case also faced potential complications due to Mizael's knowledge of police procedures and his connections within the law enforcement community. He understood how investigations were conducted and might be able to anticipate and counter some of the prosecution's strategies. Despite these challenges, Detective Silva was determined to see justice done for Mércia Nakashima. The evidence against Mizael was overwhelming, and Silva was confident that a jury would see through any attempts at manipulation or misdirection. The case would ultimately depend on the strength of the forensic evidence and the credibility of the witnesses who could testify to Mizael's obsessive and threatening behavior. The arrest. On July 8, 2010, nearly 2 months after Mércia Nakashima's disappearance and 3 weeks after the discovery of her body, Detective Silva and his team executed a warrant for the arrest of Mizael Bispo de Souza. The arrest was carefully planned and coordinated to ensure that Mizael, as a trained police officer with access to weapons, could be taken into custody safely without endangering the public or the arresting officers. The arrest took place at Mizael's apartment in São Paulo, where he was taken into custody without incident. Despite his training and access to weapons, Mizael offered no resistance when confronted with the arrest warrant. His calm demeanor during the arrest was noted by investigators who interpreted it as evidence of his calculated and cold-blooded nature. When informed of the charges against him, homicide, evidence tampering, and abuse of official position, Mizael maintained his innocence and demanded to speak with a lawyer. He showed no visible emotion upon learning that he was being charged with Mércia's murder, a reaction that investigators found disturbing given the serious nature of the accusations. The arrest of a military police officer for the murder of his ex-girlfriend sent shockwaves through the São Paulo law enforcement community. Mizael's colleagues were stunned by the allegations, with many finding it difficult to believe that someone they had worked alongside could be capable of such a crime. The case raised uncomfortable questions about screening and oversight within the military police force. Media coverage of the arrest was extensive, with news outlets providing detailed coverage of the charges and the evidence that had led to Mizael's detention. The case became a national sensation, highlighting issues of domestic violence, police accountability, and the protection of women who try to escape abusive relationships. During his initial interrogation, Mizael continued to deny any involvement in Mércia's death. He claimed that he had been in Nazaré Paulista on legitimate personal business and that his presence in the area was purely coincidental. He suggested that Mércia might have been killed by unknown criminals or by someone connected to her legal work. However, investigators were prepared for Mizael's denials and confronted him with the mounting evidence against him. They presented the forensic evidence from the car and body, the ballistics analysis linking the murder weapon to his service pistol, and the documentation of his reconnaissance trips to the disposal site. As the evidence was presented, cracks began to appear in Mizael's composure. While he continued to maintain his innocence, his explanations for the evidence became increasingly implausible and contradictory. His training as a police officer had taught him interrogation techniques, but he was now experiencing them from the other side. The interrogation revealed additional details about Mizael's planning and execution of the murder. Under pressure from experienced investigators, he inadvertently confirmed details about the crime scene and disposal site that only the killer would have known. These admissions provided additional evidence of his guilt. Mizael's arrest also led to the discovery of additional evidence that had been overlooked during the initial searches. A more thorough examination of his apartment revealed items that linked him to the crime scene and supported the prosecution's theory of premeditation and planning. The arrest warrant also included charges related to Mizael's abuse of his position as a police officer. Investigators had documented his unauthorized use of police databases to monitor Mércia and his attempts to use his official position to intimidate her and interfere with the investigation. As news of the arrest spread, Mércia's family and friends expressed relief that her killer had finally been apprehended. However, they also acknowledged that the arrest was just the first step in a long legal process that would ultimately determine whether justice would be served for Mércia's murder. The arrest marked the end of the investigation phase of the case and the beginning of the prosecution phase. Detective Silva and his team had successfully built a strong case against Mizael, but now it would be up to prosecutors and the courts to ensure that he was held accountable for his crimes.
The trial of Mizael Bispo de Souza for the murder of Mércia Nakashima began on March 15, 2013, nearly 3 years after the crime. The delay had been caused by various legal motions, appeals, and the complexity of prosecuting a police officer for such a serious crime. The trial took place in São Paulo's criminal court, with Judge Carlos Roberto presiding over the proceedings. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Maria Santos, faced the challenge of proving that a respected police officer had planned and executed the cold-blooded murder of his ex-girlfriend. They needed to convince the jury that Mizael's position of authority and his training in law enforcement had made him not a protector of society, but a dangerous predator who had used his skills to commit the perfect crime. Mizael Bispo de Souza betrayed every oath he took as a police officer when he murdered Mércia Nakashima, Santos argued in her opening statement. He used his training, his resources, and his position of authority to plan and execute a calculated murder, then attempted to cover his tracks, using his knowledge of police procedures. This was not a crime of passion, but a cold-blooded execution carried out by someone who believed his badge would protect him from justice. The prosecution's case was built on 3 pillars: forensic evidence, circumstantial evidence, and testimony about Mizael's obsessive behavior. They presented the ballistics evidence linking the murder weapon to Mizael's service pistol, the DNA and trace evidence found in Mércia's car, and the documentation of his reconnaissance trips to the disposal site. Dr. Patricia Santos, the forensic pathologist who had conducted Mércia's autopsy, testified about the nature and extent of her injuries. She explained that the gunshot wounds were consistent with execution-style killing and that the positioning of the body in the car indicated that Mércia had been murdered elsewhere and then transported to the reservoir. The prosecution also presented evidence of Mizael's obsessive behavior following his breakup with Mércia. Former colleagues, friends, and family members testified about his increasingly erratic conduct, his threats against Mércia, and his inability to accept the end of their relationship. This testimony established motive and painted a picture of a man who had become dangerous when rejected. Cell phone records and GPS data were presented to show that Mizael had been in the area where Mércia disappeared at the time of her murder, contradicting his alibi. The prosecution demonstrated that his claimed visit to a friend in Nazaré Paulista was fabricated, and that he had actually been stalking Mércia and waiting for an opportunity to attack her. The defense team, led by attorney Roberto Silva, attempted to create reasonable doubt by challenging the forensic evidence and suggesting alternative theories for the crime. They argued that the evidence against Mizael was circumstantial and that other suspects had not been adequately investigated. The prosecution wants you to convict my client based on speculation and coincidence, Silva argued. Yes, Mizael was in the area where Mércia disappeared, but that doesn't make him a killer. The forensic evidence is inconclusive, and the prosecution has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that my client committed this crime. The defense suggested that Mércia might have been killed by criminals connected to her legal work or by unknown assailants who had targeted her randomly. They attempted to portray Mizael as a dedicated police officer who had been wrongfully accused based on his relationship with the victim. However, the defense's arguments were undermined by the overwhelming weight of evidence against Mizael. The prosecution had built a comprehensive case that addressed every aspect of the crime, from planning to execution to cover-up. The evidence of premeditation was particularly damaging to the defense's attempts to create alternative theories. Testimony from Mércia's friends and family provided emotional impact to the trial, as they described the vibrant, intelligent woman whose life had been cut short by Mizael's obsession. Their testimony helped humanize the victim and reminded the jury of the real-world consequences of domestic violence. The trial also featured expert testimony about domestic violence and stalking behavior, helping the jury understand the psychological dynamics that had led to Mércia's murder. Experts explained how controlling relationships can escalate to deadly violence when the abuser's control is threatened. After 3 weeks of testimony and evidence, the case was submitted to the jury for deliberation. The weight of the evidence against Mizael was overwhelming, but the jury still had to determine whether the prosecution had proven his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The verdict. On April 8, 2013, after deliberating for 2 days, the jury returned a verdict that would finally bring justice for Mércia Nakashima and closure for her family. Mizael Bispo de Souza was found guilty on all charges: qualified homicide, evidence tampering, abuse of official position, and stalking. The verdict was unanimous, reflecting the jury's conclusion that the evidence against Mizael was overwhelming and conclusive. The reading of the verdict was an emotional moment in the packed courtroom. Mércia's family members wept with relief and gratitude that their daughter's killer had finally been held accountable for his crimes. Friends and colleagues who had supported the family throughout the long legal process embraced and celebrated the achievement of justice. Mizael showed little emotion as the verdict was read, maintaining the same cold demeanor that had characterized his behavior throughout the trial. His lack of remorse or recognition of the gravity of his crimes was noted by observers and seemed to confirm the prosecution. His portrayal of him as a calculating and dangerous individual. Judge Carlos Roberto scheduled the sentencing hearing for the following week, where he would determine the specific punishment that Mizael would receive for his crimes. Under Brazilian law, the qualified homicide conviction carried a potential sentence of 12 to 30 years in prison, with additional time possible for the other charges. The verdict was widely celebrated by women's rights advocates and domestic violence prevention organizations, who saw Mizael's conviction as an important victory in the fight against femicide in Brazil. The case had become a symbol of the need for justice and accountability when police officers abused their positions of authority. This verdict sends a clear message that no one is above the law, not even those who are sworn to enforce it.